we're really thrilled that Kentucky finally passed this legislation. There's a lot of opportunity in the state, and Ashley's right. Not only the U.S., but actually a lot of companies all over the world are now really excited to see what's going to be happening here in Kentucky. So what in the world is a public-private partnership? The term gets thrown around a ton. So Kendra, what's a P3?
Sure. I think it's important to understand at the onset, P3 has a lot of different meanings to a lot of different folks. A P3 doesn't have to be East End Crossing, which I know you all are very familiar with. It can be as simple as a private contractor doing some paving work for Kentucky's transportation cabinet, all the way across the spectrum to, as an example, the Indiana Toll Road, where a private concessionaire, in exchange for an upfront payment, is receiving toll revenues for the term of the contract and is then responsible for long-term O&M. Obviously, that business relationship, that contract looks very different than the first example of a paving contractor doing work for KYTC. And along that spectrum, we have different opportunities for private involvement all across that spectrum. And you're seeing that now in our country from the paving example all the way through to the Indiana Toll Road example. Since you all are obviously, right here in near the East End Crossing, I thought it might be helpful for me to spend a little bit of time kind of describing that deal, and we'll kind of use that, as Todd and I are talking today, as kind of a touchstone. The East End Crossing project is what's called an availability payment arrangement, and the way that deal is structured is, as everyone's well aware, it is a tolled facility. The toll revenues from the bridge crossing will go to the states of Kentucky and Indiana. They're split. Indiana's portion then will be used to make an annual payment to our concessionaire, to our private developer, who then in exchange is responsible for building the bridge as well as long-term O&M on the bridge for the term of the contract. So contrast that with the ITR deal. There, remember, the private concessionaire gave the state an upfront payment, and they get the toll revenues. So very different structure. In the ITR example, you see that the private developer is actually taking revenue risk. So if no one drives the ITR ever again, it's that private developer that's at risk there. In the East End Crossing example, if the toll revenues are insufficient to make that payment to the private developer, the state's responsible for ponying up the difference. So very different structure there, and we'll be kind of using that as Todd and I are talking today to kind of compare and contrast.
Yeah. Another example might be, Kendra has a ton of experience in roads and transportation, so I'll try to talk sometimes more about, P3 is I'll talk about public buildings, so like city halls, courthouses, libraries, sheriff's offices, schools. Those can all be done under a P3. Also water, wastewater facilities, stormwater. That's kind of like the hidden thing no one ever talks about, because Lord help us, if we actually looked under the roads and saw our pipes, we would kind of freak out at what bad condition they're under. So it's a good thing that the roads cover them and we don't actually have to think about it. On the water side, there are a couple different examples. This would be, Kendra was talking about things at the state level. I'm going to talk more at the local level. So your municipal water company, whoever you pay your bill to, they could probably right now, they're just doing it themselves. They have employees. They maintain the drinking water, and whatever happens once you flush the toilet and you guys don't think about it. There are a lot of companies around the world that want to help, so sometimes there would be what we call O&M. Kendra mentioned it already, that's operations and maintenance. Private sector company might come in and offer some expertise, maybe try to fix things if there needs something to be fixed. Or a P3 could really just be like, you might read in your local paper that the wastewater facility is crumbling and the pipes you're seeing a lot of water main breaks in the winter, and the city's like, well, sorry, we have no money to fix this, we don't know what to do. So a P3 could be that the private, in a very broad brushstroke, is the private sector is gonna come in and they're gonna operate and maintain the facility, but then they'll probably fix the pipes too. And then that portion of the water bill you all pay monthly or every 2 months, whenever you pay, some of that might go to the private sector company, so they recover their costs. So Yeah, so that's another way, another example of something you all probably deal with every day. So now that we sort of know what a P3 is, and we're happy to answer questions later, what in the world does it mean for all of you? Why should you all care that the chamber spent the last 3 years trying to pass this legislation as business leaders in the Commonwealth? What does this even mean for you? Should you be excited about it?
Right, so we're all very excited. P3 is great. So let's dive down into that a little bit. Why is P3 great? Why is everyone around the world singing the praises of P3? So there's a ton of advantages that P3 brings, but I guess one point I want to make early on here is not every project is right for P3. Not every project is a good candidate for P3, and that's part of the very important analysis that has to go on at the very beginning stages of a project development. Again, not every project is going to be the right fit, but for the projects where it is a good fit, P3 can bring operating efficiencies. Arguably the private sector is going to do a better job of operating these facilities than the public sector would. Also, the private sector is going to be incentivized through the contract to deliver the project on time and on budget. And we're seeing a real life example of that right here in downtown Louisville as well as at East End Crossing. Both of those projects are on time and on budget. Another big advantage, especially in an availability payment deal that I referred to earlier, is budgetary certainty. The Department of Transportation or whatever public agency is letting the project knows on an annual basis for the term of the contract what this asset's going to cost them. So there's no surprises, there's no, oh gosh, we had this unexpected rehab that we're going to have to put, there's no unexpected maintenance expense. It's all built into the contract. So the public agency has budgetary certainty, which is very important. Another huge advantage to P3 is risk mitigation and risk transfer. Through the P3 contract, we're able to transfer the risks, the various risks in a project, to the entity that's best able to manage those risks. So again, going back to the ITR example, the state of Indiana was actually able to transfer revenue risks to the private sector. We're not seeing as many of those deals anymore as you can expect, but risk transfer and risk mitigation is another huge advantage to P3 versus a traditional procurement where all risks reside with the public sector. Another example is better quality in construction and design. Think about it. If the private sector is going to be responsible for operating and maintaining this asset for the term of the contract, you better believe they're going to do their very best to design it and construct it to the very highest standards to mitigate their long-term O&M costs. And lastly, I think it's important to remember that as you're procuring your P3 project, you can build the contract how you want it to fit. If there are certain concepts that are important to a public sector and to your constituents, you can build those into the contract. In Indiana, disadvantaged business enterprise was very important to us, and so we built in DBE requirements into all of our P3 contracts and required the private sector to abide by those in their letting process. So you have flexibility in your contracting to build in provisions that are important to the public, to your public sector and to your constituents. You can build those right into the contract, and then the private sector is held to those standards for the term of the contract. So those are just a few of the advantages of P3.
Yeah, I mean, how many times have you guys walked into a public building and you look up at the ceiling and you're like, why are there water stains on the ceiling? Like, when was the last time anyone fixed this building? But then when you get into like the poor city council, like their budget is flatlined or declining and they have things they have to do. They have to pay their employees, they have to pay retirements. So they cut the $100,000 they were gonna do to replace the ceiling tiles this year. When you have a P3, the private sector is on the hook to make that look nice for the term of the contract. So that's just one major advantage that you would have, which is business for all of you in the state. You know that work is coming down the line versus hoping the city council is going to, obligate the money, but then them slashing it at the last minute because there's a budget cut. Another option, if there are any public sector, well, for everyone, is this gives the public sector another option for forever in this country. If you want anything done, if you want to build a road, you want to build a water treatment plant, you need to build a new library, what do? You raise taxes, you issue a levy. Like, I'm from Ohio, we call it levy. We say a levy. I don't know if that translates everywhere else. You issue bonds, like you cut something else, you budget for it. That's how you do it, and city governments have had to do it that way forever. And this gives you another option. And what's kind of ironic also, as Kendra and I think is kind of funny, is that it's kind of the US is really behind the 8 ball on this. You would think like the US with like capitalism that we would totally be using the private sector all the time to do this stuff, and oddly we don't. Canada's way ahead of us. The UK is like light years ahead of us, Australia. So, but it gives the local governments another option, which we think is great. You know, like Kendra said, sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't, but it's a good option. So, so as someone, Kendra has like led the way in Indiana for years, what do you see as the potential here in Kentucky for public-private partnerships, and where can they be used the most?
Yeah, and again, you know, I want to reiterate, none of us are suggesting that, okay, every project that's let from here on out in Kentucky is going to be done as a P3. That's not the case at all. There's a very important, as I refer to, a value for money proposition that you go through at the beginning stages of a public-private partnership, which helps you determine whether or not P3 is a good fit. Ultimately, the goal is, the thought is that through innovation, through the efficiencies that the private sector brings to these projects, ultimately the projects cost less. And guess what that means? There's more money in the coffers then to do more projects. So the idea is that ultimately, by adding a P3 option into your toolbox, there's more public funds available to do more projects, thereby broadening the pipeline, making more projects available. So that's the ultimate goal, is getting more projects done, getting our very important crumbling infrastructure in our country up into good operating condition, and done at less cost.
Yeah. One thing, I know you've spoken about big projects and you have a ton of experience in big interstates and things like that. One other another project maybe that's sometimes a little easier to wrap your head around. Sometimes these really big interstate projects, the numbers associated with them are like shocking, right? Would be something like a parking garage. I'm sure all of you live in a city or a county that has a municipally run parking garage. You pay $5-6. You have no idea where that money goes. In theory, it goes to the city to keep the parking garage running. But that's like a perfect example of a public-private partnership. What could happen, and it's a smaller project, they're like $5-6 million, so they're kind of easy for local governments to wrap their heads around. You could easily, a company could come in, simply they design, they build the parking garage, they operate it, and they maintain it for what, 20, 30, 40 years. And then what you pay goes to that company instead of potentially the city. These are nice, small little projects that we think would be great for the state or the Commonwealth to do initially. Like, they're really good, they're easy, right?
Yep, absolutely, they're kind of digestible. And so that example of the parking garage is sort of the ITR deal just sort of shrunk down, because in that example, the parking garage operator would be taking revenue risk that folks are actually going to come to the garage and pay whatever fee they charge to build the garage. Now that deal has lots of different flavors. The parking garage operator may say, you know what, I don't think that enough people are going to come here and park and pay enough to cover my costs. So guess what, city, you're going to need to kick in a little bit too, so that I'm made whole. So that's just a negotiation that would happen, again, at those very early stages. So this is part of the value for money conversation is, you know, does my project carry its own weight, or is the local government going to have to kick in some money in order to make the math work?
Exactly. And I know maybe some of you are thinking, well, I always think this at least, you're like, well, okay, this all sounds good, but wait, then the private sector could just jack up the cost of me parking in this garage, and all of a sudden I'm paying $20 a day, versus when the city ran it, I was only paying $5 a day, because the private sector, all they do is care about money. Right? That's all we care about is money. So what's the response to that?
Right, so of course there would be restrictions in the contract that would govern how often and by how much the parking rates can be raised.
Yeah. The good thing about this is there's a contract, and everything's governed by it, and it's not up to the whims of an elected official or... That's right.
That's right. And I guess that's, since you brought that up, Todd, that's a very, very important aspect of P3 is contract enforcement. I can't emphasize enough, you know, this isn't one of those deals where the deal gets cut, it gets signed, it gets stuck on a shelf in someone's office, and we're done. It's critically important that the public sector champion for the project is on board, is paying attention, is monitoring the contract, is paying attention to it, and most importantly is enforcing it. Because you've got to have that private sector individual living up to their bargain and doing what they agreed to do in the contract. That was the deal that was cut, and that's what makes the deal stick together. So long-term contract adherence is critically important. If a local government doesn't think, or a state government for that matter, doesn't think that they have the guts to stick it out for the term of the contract or the desire to stick it out, then P3 is not a good option, because as soon as you stop enforcing that contract, guess what's going to happen? The private sector is not going to comply, and then you got a bad deal, and no one wants that. So long-term contract enforcement is critically important to these deals.
Okay. So we're looking at a couple hundred private sector leaders right now. What advice would you give them as, they want to get involved in P3s? What should they do?
I would encourage each of you to figure out who the P3 sort of market leaders are in your industry, and feel free to reach out to me or Todd's organization. We'd be happy to help you kind of piece that together. But reach out to those folks and talk to them about P3. What's been their experience in P3? What are the risks that they see, and how do they deal with those risks? What projects do they see coming down the pipeline, and where do they see the opportunity? But I think it's important to start that dialogue, and I think you'll find that everyone in the P3 community is very open. It's a pretty small community in the U.S. still, but it's a very open community, and folks are excited about your legislation, and they're going to want to help. And so reach out to them and just find out through your industry, trade groups and the like, find out who the leaders are and how they've kind of how they're dealing with public-private partnerships. I guess the other thing I would encourage each of you to do is to think about what innovations are you going to bring to this. That's the real benefit to P3, is the innovation, the experience that you bring to these projects. So I'd encourage you all to think about, when you're driving down the road and you see a project being done and it just drives you nuts that they're doing something, now's your chance to fix that. Or if you see a building being built and you're like, gosh, why do they do that? Every time they build a building, they do it that way. I do it this other way that's much more efficient, much better. Now's your chance to have a voice in that. So think about the efficiencies that you would bring to public sector projects and bring those forward. This is the time, and that's what makes P3 great, is that efficiency that the private sector brings, and innovation.
I would only add, because it's selfish, get educated. And I happen to run an association that educates people on public-private partnerships, but they are a different way of doing things. So getting up to speed, it is a little bit different. Sometimes contracts are complicated, I would say. So getting up to speed, getting educated is pretty important.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So I guess on the other side of that coin then, what about the public sector? They have this brand new tool that they can use. What do they even do?
So similarly, I would encourage public sector folks to reach out to the project champions in our country who've led these P3 projects and just pick their brain a little bit about their experience. It's pretty transparent who's been the project leaders out there on the web. You can figure that out pretty easily. And I'd encourage you to reach out to them and find out, what's gone well in their projects, what hasn't gone so well, what would you do differently, what were the mistakes that you made that you could possibly learn from. But I'd encourage you to reach out to those folks. It's a very open group, and most of these people are pretty anxious to talk about their projects, so I promise they'll be more than happy to talk with you about it. I guess the other very important piece of this puzzle is we've got to start educating the public. We've got to get the public familiar with P3, help them understand it, educate them. That's a critical part of the process that cannot be overlooked. This is new and it's different, and it's going to be a little scary at first, so we've got to get people comfortable with it, and you've got to explain the benefits. Again, explain that not every project in Kentucky is now going to be done as a P3. We're going to have a careful analysis at the beginning of the project to determine whether or not P3 is the right tool. But I can tell you from a project in my hometown of Indianapolis that didn't have a happy result, public involvement early on and getting folks on board with P3 and with that model of delivery is absolutely critically important to the long-term success of your project. And now's the time to start that. I think that's an easier conversation to have sometimes outside of an actual project. If you're just kind of talking about P3 in general, folks are generally more willing to listen, they're more open. If you're talking about it in the terms of a specific project, it kind of gets a little too close to home and people might not be so willing to listen to it. So spread the good word word.
Yeah, you brought up, not to harp on it, but then you brought up a project in your hometown, so the Indianapolis Justice Center complex, and it was a deal that went south at the very bitter end. So I think that brings up some of the challenges, but one of them is probably the need for champions, since this is so new and we're doing things completely differently. Can you talk a little bit about how important it is to have a champion?
Sure, absolutely, yeah. Every P3 project needs a public sector champion, someone who's going to get out there and talk about the project, talk about why P3 is the right fit for this project. And that public sector champion goes back to my earlier comments about contract enforcement. That person also has to be willing to enforce that contract throughout the term. Now, I'm not saying that that person necessarily has to stay in that agency forever, but there needs to be a champion in the agency enforcing the contract for the term of the contract. I think another comment about the Indianapolis project, political risk is real in these deals, and the private sector, and you all in the room, I'm sure understand this. That's what scares. That's the biggest risk to the private sector in these deals is political risk. The private sector invested millions and millions of dollars in the Indy project before it unfortunately didn't move forward, and that's a real risk here, and that's something that the public sector is going to have to deal with, and they're going to have to learn how to get the private sector comfortable that this deal is real, it's moving forward, and we're going to mitigate that political risk, because that's I think probably the biggest challenge to these projects.
Yeah, get a champion that's not a political person that's going to be out of office in a year.
Right.
Get someone that's going to stick around and that is well liked and not polarizing.
Yeah.
So one of the other things as some challenges, sometimes when we talk about P3s, people listen, but then it's because it is new and different, it's almost like, oh my gosh, I'm going to lose my job because the private sector is going to come in here and steal public sector jobs, and that might be something like a misconception people hear. So what do we say to that?
Again, that goes right back to the contract flexibility I was talking about earlier. You can build whatever provisions into your contract that are important to you, and if it's an important, if that's a concern for this particular project or for the constituents there or for the workforce for a particular project, you can build in those requirements into the contract. And the private sector will let you know whether or not those are acceptable, and they'll let you know whether or not it's going to cost you. And then the public sector just has to make that decision if that's good value for money to include those provisions or not.
Yeah, one example we were talking about earlier, there's a drinking water and wastewater P3 project outside of Los Angeles in San Bernardino County, the town of Rialto. And they were able, it's a P3 concession deal, but the interesting part of that deal is there was people were upset, like especially some of the merit employees on staff thinking like, the private sector is going to come in, I'm union, my job's going to be cut, I'm going to lose my pension, and you're going to bring in all these like out-of-state people because it was a foreign-owned company that was going to then do the water, wastewater. So it had a lot of things that made people really nervous. And like Kendra said, they were able to write the contract so that the private sector company said to all the union employees that were currently working at the wastewater plant, you're going to be able to keep your job. We will guarantee your job at this facility for this number of years at the same pay rate for, it was 1 or 2 years, I can't remember. Then the private sector, they were blunt. They were like, we're probably going to find some efficiencies here. We might have some redundancies in staff. We will guarantee you a job, though, within company-wide for up to like 10 years. So that's a pretty good deal. And that was able to eliminate some of the union fears. And then also, and I don't know the details of this, but it was something, the people were able to stay within the California state retirement system. So they weren't, and the private sector was able to somehow pay into it. And I'm not at all educated enough on retirement systems to know how that worked, but it really alleviated some of the fears. And so, like Kendra said, it was in the contract, and then people kind of were like, well, this will actually work. We'll save money. People kept their jobs. I get to keep my retirement. The big bad company is not coming in and firing all of us. Okay, we can go along with this. Yeah. Absolutely. So that was positive. So I think we only have a couple minutes left, but we wanted to talk about.
Yeah, so Todd, maybe you have a little bit more of a national view maybe than I do. Maybe you could talk a little bit about some of the trends that you're seeing right now kind of in the country and how that might apply here in Kentucky.
Yeah, I mean, I think the big trend, and It's not going away, and none of us can escape it. I guess in theory, we're out of this recession we've been in for a while. I know we're out of it. But you're not seeing states and counties and cities, their budgets aren't skyrocketing back to the levels they were at, in like 2004 or something, even 2006. But our infrastructure is still crumbling. We still have the need to fix the bridge or for the new stormwater pipes or the new city hall. The university still needs new dorms. There's not this, even though the economy is doing better, states aren't spending more. We've all gotten used to like taxes at a certain level. No politician is raising taxes these days. I mean, let's be honest, it's just not happening. And talk to anyone, especially, I'm a DC guy, so everyone on Capitol Hill, they're like, there's absolutely no way we're gonna start giving money to the states like we used to give in the 80s and 90s. That's just not gonna happen unless like Bernie Sanders were elected. There's absolutely no way of massive infrastructure funding coming out of Washington. So all of us sitting in the states, we're like, okay, that's great. So how do we do all this? So we're saying, hey, here you go, you can do a P3. We're giving you at least one additional option. The dynamics aren't changing. Our taxes aren't gonna get raised. We're not going to fall into a giant vat of money anytime soon to fix all of our infrastructure. So we've got to do something. The bond market's been great. The US has relied on it forever. It's done great, but now maybe we need just something else like that can offer an assist. And yeah.
It's just a way to do more with less, right?
Exactly, it's a way to do more with less. And just kind of like sky's the limit in terms of potential projects. Like, we all sort of gravitate towards roads and toll roads because that's what we know, but I mean, other countries are leading the way actually even within the US, like Michigan just started something with a P3 for all their streetlights.
Right.
That's, another one of those things I guess we all kind of forget about until you see the bulb out and you get pissed off and you call your city council woman and you yell at her because the streetlights are out on your street, but you don't realize how expensive it is.
Right.
So,
yep.
Yeah. And one other quick trend we're seeing, the feds really aren't involved in P3s. It's, for better or worse, one of the few things they don't really touch unless you're in the Defense Department. But federal agencies are starting to guide local communities. We're working with EPA right now, trying to find ways for P3s in stormwater. I know it's, again, I brought it up already because I feel bad. Everyone neglects the poor pipes under our streets and no one has any idea what condition they're in. And a funny anecdote was a community meeting with EPA and they brought in a consultant and the consultant's like, I'm gonna lower a camera into your pipes so you guys can see what condition they're in. And then they started doing this and the city leader pulled the private sector guy out and was like, what the hell are you doing? I don't wanna see that because if I see that, then I'm gonna know what awful condition they're in and then I'm going to have to fix them. And I have absolutely no money to fix this. People fix potholes, they don't fix pipes. So there's a big need. So anyway, and we are officially out of time. Sure.
Agree to that. Representative, you have one, sir? If we could, if someone could it'd be best if we had a mic. I see only one back here. Can someone bring up the handheld mic, or is that possible? Right here? There you go.
Recently, the Metropolitan Sewer District wanted to raise the rates 20%. We have a $13 billion problem with our drainage system and everything. How would the private sector work into a position like this to save us money and actually do possibly a better job? How would we pay for it?
Well, I mean, arguably, arguably the idea is that through efficiencies, through the design, through the construction, through the long-term maintenance, the private sector would do it better, cheaper, faster, and your tax increase would go further and enable you, therefore, you have more dollars available and enable you to repair more pipes. I think that's kind of the short answer.
How can you do it cheaper than what they're doing with their engineers and so forth? How can you do it cheaper?
They would bring cutting-edge technology that they've used around the world in, and maybe there's ways to do things more efficiently, use different materials, do things that the local government just might not, be aware of because they weren't exposed to that.
Would there be a way, Kendra, in that situation, would the private sector ever be willing, I think you said a $13 billion, would the private sector ever be willing to come in and say, like, we're willing to do like all of this if in return we get a cut of the water bills?
Sure, absolutely. I mean, you can design the world, or maybe to your point, maybe there isn't a way. I mean, maybe that project isn't a good candidate for P3. I mean, sometimes if there isn't enough opportunity for efficiencies, then it doesn't really make sense to do a P3, and the more traditional procurement method is the best there, and it's not really worth going through all these bells and whistles with a P3. If the public sector has a good approach and there's no opportunities for efficiencies, then it just may not be a good candidate for P3.
Just follow up, Bill.
Sure.
If this can be done less expensively, why aren't more people, governments jumping on it?
If P3 is less so, I think the question is, if P3 is cheaper, why aren't more people doing it?
Yeah.
Is that the question? Yeah, I think, well, until recently, you haven't had legislation authorizing you to do it, so you couldn't do it. So, I mean, I think that's,
I think some of it is education. I mean, if you go, so we went to law school, but I guess if you got your master's in public administration and you wanted to go be a city manager, sometimes they don't even teach this in school. And like we said, cities and governments have been doing it a certain way since the 1800s, I would assume. You're the bond lawyer. Right. So it's just like a brand new way of doing things, and you guys have legislation now and you're able to use it, but there are a lot of other states that have legislation. I was on the phone with someone from Minnesota the other day. I'm like, you guys have legislation, but I have absolutely no idea that anyone's ever used it because no one decided to educate the state and local people that could actually use it, that they had this as an option. So it's kind of, even though like 40 states have P3 legislation now, really only like Florida, Virginia, Texas a little bit, California a little bit, Indiana a little bit, like use it. They just don't, Georgia's had it for however many years and they still haven't done anything with it, except they are starting to do it with university dorms, which I know, didn't UK do that as well? As a Gator, it pains me to talk about the University of Kentucky, but I will try. I believe they're doing it with dorms because it's a little easier to do that.
Let's go back here to this gentleman.
Thank you. Charles George, Kentucky Society of CPAs. You mentioned that we've had P3s in Kentucky for a long time now, so I think a lot of people are probably wondering what really changed as a result of the legislation that just passed.
So I think what the change is, so previously you were able to do sort of my example of a paving contractor, filling potholes for KYTC. What you have now is the more robust P3 that allows you to move further along that spectrum to more heavy involvement by the private sector. So it's just, you've just sort of moved along the continuum, so to speak.
Hi, Kendra.
Hi, Carrie.
Full disclosure, I'm Kerry Stemler. I serve on the Indiana Finance Authority's board, and I served when Kendra was director there. So you guys are doing a great job. A couple examples. I'm a proponent of P3s, and I think it is very positive that Kentucky has this tool now. It does truly spur innovation and creativity. One example that comes to mind that probably might help this gentleman's question, even though it wasn't a true P3 project, but the procurement of that project was done under Indiana. The Milton-Madison Bridge, when you think about how that bridge was reconstructed, that wasn't an idea that the states put out for the contractors to look at. To build that bridge on temporary piers and then slide it over onto the existing piers which saved that bridge from being closed and ferrying those commuters for up to almost a year. So what it really does is bring that innovation, worldwide innovation, into projects like that. So that's the kind of out-of-the-box thinking. It could be a pipe project where the newest, greatest innovation is how to reline a pipe to create a new infrastructure without, just like directional drilling did for us in a lot of that type of work. The other thing, Kendra, you both have touched on it, but the life cycle, how that project is built and how it's thought of and how that project is then turned back over to the state or the municipality. The East End Bridge, when that bridge is turned back over to the state of Kentucky and the state of Indiana on both sides, the condition in which that project has to be brought back. And Kendra, you might even want to elaborate on that a little bit.
Absolutely.
So
yeah.
those are a couple points that I think you need to think of. It really gives you new ideas on ways to solve problems.
Yeah, that's a great point, Carrie. Thank you. So another important part of the contracting in these deals is the handover requirements. And this goes right back to my earlier point about having your project champion on board and enforcing that contract literally through the last day. Because guess what? On the last day, the private developer is going to turn your project back over to you. And if your contract was drafted appropriately, it's going to be in pristine condition. You're going to get a brand new asset back because they've been operating and maintaining it and doing long-term rehab on it through the life of the contract. But you've got to have somebody there, again, enforcing the contract and making sure that you're getting the benefit of the bargain, that the public sector is getting the benefit of the bargain, and you're getting a like-new asset given back to you at the end of the deal.
Play here is the fact that you're not awarding that contract just based on price. It's a component of different items, how they scored it. And Kendra, you could even go back and explain how we did the East End on how it was scored. So a public project, when it's bid strictly on price typically, not on what the best value is.
Right, that's right. And again, so as an example, on Easton Crossing, the decision was made many, many moons ago that bridge was going to be a landmark bridge. The communities surrounding that bridge wanted it to be a beautiful bridge, and so that was part of our scoring mechanism through the P3. It wasn't just price. You know, the beauty of the bridge was and it was a little bit more complicated than that, but that was actually a scoring mechanism through the procurement. So, and again, that goes right back to you can build your deal how you want to build the deal. So.
We have time for one more if somebody's got something.
I've got Nick Rowe with American Water. We're the largest private water and wastewater utility in the United States. We're in about 47 states. So you're right, P3 is nothing new, but it's probably new to us in Kentucky. And being a native Kentuckian, we're always a little slow to adapt. So I think your examples are worthwhile. You know, we manage in public-private partnerships about 12 military bases with the federal government where it really is a P3. We don't call it that, but really is, where the federal government has stepped out of the water and wastewater business, so we're in 50-year operating contracts. Infrastructure for streets, roads, bridges, water, wastewater systems are going to be in such demand over the next 2 decades that P3 is going to be the only way we're going to be able to maintain our infrastructure in America. And we realize that in our space. So we're doing a lot of public-private partnerships like with the City of Tampa, where the City of Tampa owns a wastewater facility and a water facility, but we manage it under a 20-year contract in order to create efficiencies. And I think one of the gentlemen asked, what's the benefit? Well, the real benefit is the size of the private sector who can bring capital in and cash in to make those capital improvements, and at the same time be able to create some efficiencies for that municipality or for that city. And really cash is kind of king right now in this tough economy, and I think federal funding for these type of infrastructure projects, as you guys have mentioned, is going to dry up. So I think the private sector, with a partnership with the public, is really the way of the future. And being a native Kentuckian, again, we're always lagging a little bit. This has been going on, and we're doing it in California. We're doing it in many of our states around the 47 states we're operating in. So nothing new. So thank you for bringing it forward.
Absolutely.
You're welcome.
So just one last final question in about 30 seconds. If you mentioned education, if people aren't attending this meeting or are not aware of all of the details that one needs, Todd, you said your group is available, but I think it's important for smaller municipalities smaller counties outside of the urban areas to really be up to date on this. So real quickly, how is it best that they get that information?
Well, my organization working with the chamber, we're going to do, like Ashley mentioned, something in Lexington if smaller communities can travel to Lexington at the end of October. But then another thing we've been talking to the chamber about is almost like a traveling roadshow, because imagine if you're in a smaller community and your planning office is only one person or two people and they just don't have time to do this and to learn. So we need to go to them. And it is a little labor intensive, and that's kind of the problem I face every day, that I have to teach. It's almost, someone told me that it's more than 50,000 different entities across the country issue bonds, and they could potentially use P3s. So yeah, unless they're like in this room right now, I have to go to them.